Hello and welcome to Lit Grad Life. Today I want to talk about analyzing poetry. First, I think it's important to go over a couple of vocabulary words. This is how I teach poetry or how I start to teach poetry in my own class. So these are some of the words that we use or that we identify for students in my particular department when we get into this unit. First things first is that poetry is often spoken by a speaker, which is not the same as a narrator. In literature or poetry, the speaker is the narrative voice, similar to the narrator, who is speaking the text, but is not necessarily the author. More so, they are a persona or character presenting the words to the audience as though they are a narrator, but really more a character themselves. Tone refers obviously to the author or speaker's attitude or approach towards the subject matter or the audience. It is conveyed through word choice and style and can range from formal to informal, serious to playful, or positive to negative. Poetry makes use of a lot of figurative language, which is language that goes beyond the literal meaning of words to express ideas in creative ways. We have, as an example of figurative language, metaphor, which is a figure of speech that makes a comparison between two unrelated things, such as saying time is a thief. And we have symbolism or symbols, which are often like an object or character or figure. Sometimes a color that represent more of an abstract idea or concept within the work. Sort of like a dove often symbolizing peace, or the color red often symbolizing some sort of passion or danger. And we also make use of the word alliteration. Alliteration is essentially the repetitiveness of the same consonant sound at the beginning of closely connected words. Often, this is used in poetry or in prose to create a rhythm or emphasis. So, for example, those tongue twisters, she sells seashells by the seashore. Now, when we're talking about poetry and analyzing poetry, one of the things that we also like to talk about, of course, is annotating a poem or annotation in general. First, you would want to do an initial reading of the poem and write out questions, perhaps in the margin, that pop into your head while you're doing your initial reading. Perhaps identifying or underlining words that you don't understand and looking them up later, things like that. Writing out definitions on the poem itself or using sort of hand to paper helps to really hit home a lot more ideas in the mind of the reader. Annotation is a great tool in any sort of literary study. And the example here might be a little bit more aggressive. It's an annotation of an Emily Dickinson poem taken from an open educational resource called Let's Get Writing. And on the right, I actually have taken a screenshot of the Poetry Foundation for Those Winter Sundays by Robert Hayden, which is another example of annotation just on a digital form. So when we start reading poetry, perhaps even writing it, one of the things that you'll probably come to find is that it's not so difficult as you may have been led to believe. Um, do you need to know every single term when understanding poetry or all of the structures and the different sounds? I don't think that you do. Um, but is it as straightforward as maybe Matthew Zephyr, who is an award-winning American poet, may lead you to believe in a New York Times article on the subject? Which you should go look up, and I'll link it in the description below. Also, no. While I agree with Zephyr that, on several points made in his article, I also recognize that he is an award winning poet and a professor on the subject, making poetry his specialty. And as anyone outside of a specialty can recognize, that also means that his perspective of what is easy can somewhat be warped. In the same way that my perspective, for example, on short stories, which would be like my specialty, is warped compared to my friend's perspective on writing romances, which is her, specialty. There are challenges to poetry, both in understanding and writing, and those challenges tie into language. Poetry requires a lot of compression of potential information into very few words, and you maybe don't need to know the exact structure or literary devices being used to fully appreciate the work. But you do need to have a grasp of the content's literal meaning and contextual or metaphorical understanding. Lots of poetry tries to implement different literary techniques to get across a main idea or meaning. So, for example, applying abstract ideas of humanism to the blowing of wind. There may be something to it, but that is going to be difficult for everyday readers to grasp, and probably even some experts, I would say. Essentially, if the idea is too complicated and the meaning um, too too extensive, it can sometimes get lost. And that may be why some contemporary poetry is difficult for new readers to engage with, or even historical poetry is difficult to engage with. It may also be difficult to engage with ideas that are niche to a particular area, such as localized texts, if you will, as they are too specific and have too wide a meaning at times. When discussing this idea, I like to encourage people to read William Wordsworth, who was an English Romantic poet that helped launch the Romantic literary period. I like to encourage students, especially, to read William Wordsworth's Preface to Lyrical Ballads. According to Wordsworth's theory of poetry, there are three principles guiding the composition of lyrical ballads. And this, honestly, I think applies to all poetry. But I want to keep in mind the context that this is a preface for a book of ballads. Firstly, poetry must concern itself primarily with nature and life. And second, the reason for writing lyrical ballads is that they emphasize the status of poetry as a form of art, one that intends to enlighten readers to the true depth of human emotion and experience. Third, Wordsworth argues that good poetry doesn't have to be overly complicated or ornamental in order to capture the reader's imagination, or the first two of these 3 points. Rather, Wordsworth finds that clean, simple lines are best to get across your meaning. Literary tricks and devices such as personification, which is a figure of speech intended to represent an abstract quality of humanistic experiences to something non human, can sometimes make it difficult for writers or readers to connect or to speak simply and directly about their feelings. If we reflect on the historically recognized best poets, we find that they often meet these three qualities in their work. Shakespeare and his sonnets speak to the depth of human experience in life, making them timeless despite their original setting being in English past. Walt Whitman spoke of nature and life in a similar quality, making his work similarly timeless and accessible. Emily Dickinson, too, expressed human emotions in ways that were short and sweet and to the point. So when we engage with a poem that we're not understanding, it may be that we do not yet have a grasp of the language's contextual and metaphorical meaning, and thereby fail to connect with it intellectually, emotionally, or spiritually. Of course, sometimes we do need to understand the actual context of the poem, such as with certain satire or politically motivated poems. However, even those can take on a timeless quality as history has a tendency to repeat itself. What we should try to remember from this essentially is that poetry offers us as readers a window to the human experience. The great poets make statements about the emotional and physiological heavy and or sorry psychological not physiological the great of poets or greatest poets make statements about the emotional and psychological heavy lifting that poetry undertakes, as when the verse playwright Christopher Fry says, poetry is the language by which man explores his own amazement with the world. Poetry uses language to take us to a place beyond language and into emotion, and therefore, reading poetry requires more than just your brain, it requires your heart or your emotional center too. That comes from Thomas Foster's How to Read Poetry Like a Professor, pages 6 to 7. I'll be honest with you, I was never a major fan of poetry when I was in school. It just has never been a major part of like my interest. But still, I like listening to poetry well enough, and particularly slam poetry or anything written by some of my friends who are poets. However, I've always struggled with the subject, both as a creator and within the critical perspective. And as such, I tended to avoid poetry classes when I was a student. I almost treated them like they were a plague within the curriculum of my literary studies, but I couldn't avoid it forever. And now I teach it. And I've come to find my avoidance as a post grad to have been something, you know, somewhat funny now, considering how much I enjoy teaching the subject. Poetry is simply too large to ignore in regards to subject matter, and too engaging to continue approaching with such apprehension. Poetry can be really enjoyable. They're often lyrical. Almost all music that we listen to with words is, in a way, a poem. And so our approach to them critically is important. It's important work as we engage with the medium near constantly. As with most literary forms, when we examine a text, we must consider the literal and figurative meaning while determining how these two meanings interact and intersect. Sometimes the process is very straightforward. However, that's not always the case, particularly with poetry. I believe that this is because poetry also considers the versification or the meter, rhyme, rhythm, stanza form, and patterns. It is typically meant to be performed or said aloud, from what I understand, and therefore has a lot more to consider than novel or play script types of text, which typically clarify how something is said if that is important to the tone of the work. The way in which the words are broken up in poetry instead can add just as much meaning as anything else, and so too can pronunciation. I like to use the example of ideology. If we, of course, have we of course have the meaning of the word. It stems from the idea or ideas, especially one which forms the basis of economic or political theory and policy. We also have a few ways of pronouncing this word in English, which can create very different meanings in the mind. So, ideology is the typical pronunciation, it is the correct way to say the word. However, if you have been watching certain news programs lately, you may have heard it pronounced slightly differently. Usually, when someone is referring to somebody's ideology, of somebody that they disagree with, they might call it ideology instead of ideology. The first pronunciation, ideology, brings to mind the idea of the word idea, or brings to mind literally the word idea. It has a hard D sound at the beginning. And the second pronunciation, ideology, brings to mind a different word, such as idiot, because of the lift and softening of that D sound. The word has not changed in the literal definition, but can bring to mind a very different understanding to the listener based on how that word is pronounced. In written poems, versification helps us figure out the context and the way that we should be reading or mindful of reading when we're presenting the meaning of the text. And therefore, the poetic form demands more of the reader in terms of understanding than prose. It demands intellectual thought over the text, emotional, and potentially spiritual too, as you try to help understand and guide meaning within your reading. And with that defined, let's get into how we can analyze it, because how we do so is also different to a degree from how we analyze other literary forms. So, analyzing poetry differs from analyzing prose or short stories in several key ways, primarily due to the difference in form, structure, and intent. Here's a breakdown of how poetry analysis contrasts with prose or a short story analysis. First, we can begin with the baseline using Wordsworth's preface of Lyrical Ballads that I mentioned before. Poetry should focus on nature and life, and likely does so in almost every poem you encounter. Its purpose is to deepen understanding of human emotions. So, if we are beginning to understand a poem, we're likely going to feel some sort of emotional engagement with it. And thirdly, simplicity in language makes poetry more accessible. So there's no need to be overly complicated in finding out what those literary devices are, meaning that the word and the poem are likely to be understandable to the intended audience, and how they are used in the sentence of the poem should make sense to us. If not, we should look them up. This also means that we're more likely to encounter things like similes and metaphors, alliteration, and personification than we are more complicated literary terms that we might find in prose or novels, short stories, etc., like subplots or the five-act structure and so on. That's not to say that no poems have these things. Epic poems like the Odyssey or the Iliad, I think Beowulf, for example, certainly would have such things as structured subplots and plots, just that a vast majority of poetry does not. When we analyze poetry, we tend to use a formalist approach, and formalism is a literary theory, an approach that focuses on analyzing the form and structure of the text rather than its content or historical context or author intent. It emphasizes the intrinsic features of the work, such as structure, or the arrangement of parts in a work, how the stanzas act or are organized. We have literary devices such as the metaphor, simile, imagery, symbolism, and other elements of the craft. There's language such as dictation, syntax, tone, and style. Form, such as the genre of the work specifically, and how it adheres or deviates to that particular form. Rhythm and meter. Formalists are especially interested oftentimes in the sound patterns and meters. And then formalism tends to assume that all the meaning needed to understand a text is contained within the text itself, and that any external factors, such as the author's background or historical events, are not necessary for its interpretation. Formalism is particularly suited for poetry because poetry often emphasizes structure and sound and these, small literary devices. A formalist analysis of a poem might focus, for example, on on a rhyme scheme and meter, such as iambic pentameter, or it may focus on the use of figurative language, such as metaphors, simile, personification, etc., and how the poem forms contributes to its overall meaning. So, the effect of an enjambment or stanza break, for example. Interpretation in poetry often involves reading between the lines and exploring multiple meanings or interpretations. A single poem can have many layers of meaning that emerge through a close reading of language or structure and sound. While prose can also have multi-layered meanings, the interpretation of a short story usually revolves around understanding the plot, characters, themes, and motivations. The meaning is often more explicit and tied to the events of the story, though literary fiction can be sometimes as symbolic as poetry. Sadly, poetry is oftentimes the shortest unit when I'm teaching. And still, it's important to provide a good foundation for students. And I think that it would be good to provide a good foundation for anybody who's interested in poetry in general. So if you're interested in really understanding poetry, I want to recommend the sources currently listed on the screen. Harvard University has a great poetry guide with lots of information about poetry and poetic form that I think is interesting. There's the preface to Lyrical Ballads, as I encouraged before, from Williams Wordsworth. Poetry 101 from Shakespeare to Rupi Kaur, to iambic pentameter and blank verse, everything you need to know about poetry, the Adams 101 version, I think would be really helpful. For some, it certainly gives a wide variety of different authors in this particular field and different ways of understanding poetry. How to Read Poetry Like a Professor by Thomas Foster is also quite helpful. And, making a poem yourself can be helpful. TED Talk by Melissa Kovacs is also very good. Reading and consuming poetry, practicing with it, practicing creating it is oftentimes, though, I think one of the best ways to really understand a medium in depth. So with that, thank you so much, and I hope to see you in another video.